Hey everybody, welcome to week 3. So this week we're going to be covering factions and a little bit of review, but I'm going to be adding some new information. We got our guest lecturer Mo here. Okay, she's gone already. So we're going to review a little bit of the divide and the establishment of the first political party system in the United States, do a bit of review of everything we've covered in the first 2 weeks, and then make sure we're having a good understanding of what's due this week, and we'll get going. So let's go. So, this week's learning objectives, we're going to expand the discussion a little bit regarding the first political party system and look at it through the lens of how Alexander Hamilton and John Jay contributed to the formation of the Federalist Party and how Thomas Jefferson and James Madison worked together to create the formation of the Democratic Republicans. So we also are going to understand, because we're covering the topic of factions, which is another way of looking at the topic of political polarization. So we're going to have a little very brief discussion about contemporary political polarization through the lens of understanding a key term, bipartisanship. We're also going to look at the first political party system through the lens I previously mentioned. Make sure we confidently understand the 3 reasons why this constitutes the first political party system, and really make sure we have a firm understanding of what really primarily 5 different policy positions, what party believes what is best. So let's begin. All right. So we remember the Federalist Party. This is the collective that first started gathering, I guess you could say, during the Constitutional Convention of 1787, when they were before they were even a political party, when they were simply an ideological group focusing on the ratification of the Republican Constitution. So we see, when you look at the eventual political party that was formed under the title the Federalist Party, we see a lot of the same overarching views, although there are some differences. And the Federalist Party, once solidified, maintains a stricter focus on strengthening the central government, while the Federalist Party during the ratification process focused more so on advocating for a general federalist system at large, and didn't necessarily have clear advocacy for the strengthening of the central entity within that system. So let's talk about the Federalist Party. It's important that we remember exactly what policy agendas are represented within each collective. We already briefly covered this, but let's make sure we have a concrete understanding. So, Federalist Party wants federalism, a strong central government that unites all of the states. Think of certain policy agendas that were quite inflammatory at the times, around 1796 election, the 1800 election. A great example that focuses on this is the debate around the federal bank, a institution that we see in the news and even in contemporary days, with significant impact over domestic markets. So federalism wanted a strong central government. Federal bank would strengthen that central government by creating a financial reliance upon the central government. Remember, each state after the Revolutionary War incurred a mass amount of individualized debts to foreign nations. So these states indebted to other nations had their debts collected by the federal government. You can simply say assumed state debts. So we see that strengthen the reliance on this central government, as they had economic influence throughout all 13 states at the time. We also see the reasoning being they feared anarchy and mob rule. When we read Federalist Paper number 10 today, we're really going to have that solidified. How fearful, especially some theorists like James Madison, were of mob rule, although it is worth noting he did not align with the Federalist Party once we hit the 1790s. But that we'll save for just a couple of slides later. But so we see a consistent fear of mob rule. When we even look at some of the founding fathers' original texts, we see, instead of them referring to the people at times, we see them referring to them as the mob. And if you think about a concept in political theory called the state of nature, Thomas Hobbes represents this unique take on the state of nature. It's basically saying, imagine the world without any government. The Federalist Party would say a world without any government would be mightily scary. They would be fearful of this system, as it would be vulnerable to the mob rule, and anarchy. Um, so understanding their fears is essential to understanding their incentives for wanting a strong central government. So in addition to fearing anarchy and mob rule, wanting a strong central government through policies like the federal bank. We also see they use broad constructionism. That simply means loose interpretations of the Constitution. Because what does the Constitution do? What is it? What is this document intended to do? Remember the first week's lecture, we talked about a constitutional republic, and it is when a constitution defines and restricts the central government entity. So we see the Federalist Party, if they want to strengthen the central government, they would loosely interpret the Constitution as if you were trying to work around certain rules, you would, as we would say, bend the rules. You would try and rework the interpretations of said rules to not restrict you as heavily. That's, loosely speaking, a way the Federalists view interpreting our Constitution. We need to have the ability for our Constitution to live and breathe and bend and flow with each generation and each new security threat that the nation faces. So although this document restricts the central government, we must be able to let it enable the central government to act efficiently. Think of Shays' Rebellion and how certain restrictions within our federal government and within our Constitution could make it to where Congress and the federal armies, if we had one at the time, would restrict their effectiveness and ability to respond. And a Federalist would say it'd be important to have the Constitution live and breathe and enable our states to respond effectively when needed. We also see when you talk about building a state, because remember, this is us addressing the idea of what we could do if we had the opportunity to determine the own governance for our families and the generations to come. We see that you also have to address how the government interacts with the economy. So the Federalists advocated for strong protectionism. Think of this as using tariffs and subsidies, as supporting the creation of a federal bank that helps regulate domestic markets. So protectionism basically states with a decent amount of government interference in domestic markets. The government has the ability to implement tariffs to build up, as we remember from high school history, infant industries that are needing a few decades or so, or years, to build up to be able to compete on the international stage. So we see this economic policy advocated consistently among the Federalists, hoping for high levels of government intervention to build up domestic markets. Now, when we do talk about creating a state, of course we have to understand what type of state we're building, why we're building it, how we're going to interpret our guiding documents, what we're going to do with the economy, but most of all, we're not alone on this planet. How are we going to interact with the international stage? And the Federalists strongly identify with a Anglophile sentiment. Remember, John Adams, our second president, represented the Federalist Party when he obtained the presidency in 1796, and he also worked as a diplomat abroad for Britain, and in that time realized the benefits that could come with a positive relation with Britain and the United States, as we significantly could benefit from their trade and positive relations in that sense. So a Federalist would say the most rational way to build up domestic markets and build up the nation is by doing this through the nation that is the global hegemon at the time. They're leading the entire world in political dominance. You see they have dominance in trade and one of the most dominating militaries that exists in the planet at the time. So a Federalist would say we need to align with Britain. So Alexander Hamilton, what was his role in the Federalist Party? Well, for one, we know that Alexander Hamilton held a significant amount of positions within our federal government. He was an assistant to George Washington as a general. He was a member of the Continental Congress, co-author of the Federalist Papers, writing the most Federalist Papers of all three of them, which we do have to remember. Who are they? John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. He was our first Secretary of the Treasury. If you're curious about that position, it's currently Scott Bassett. And we do eventually see him acting as a senior officer in the U.S. Army prior to his death when he was shot and killed in a duel with Aaron Burr, due primarily to personal social conflict, but at the same time representing the tensions present in early American history. So Alexander Hamilton, maintaining all those positions in government, advocated for a strong executive, the creation of a federal bank, and the assumption of state debts. We see during George Washington's presidency, he would oftentimes uh, have debates with Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, pulling from both partisan perspectives, maintaining that the executive was unaffected by a single partisan preference. So Alexander Hamilton oftentimes winning out with the sentiments around economic intervention, resulting in our early American government having a strong focus on the role of establishing and building up domestic markets, frequently using tariffs, subsidies, and eventually creating the federal bank. Remember, he's the co-author of the Federalist Papers. In these papers, you see a strong advocacy of a sense of a unitary government. When we look back at the the Constitutional Convention of 1787, there is a unique moment at that convention. After James Madison has proposed the Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan has boiled up as an opposition point to the Virginia Plan. Remember the two divides along the debate of the Constitution. We also see a plan proposed not long after the New Jersey Plan. It was, of course, our boy on Broadway always takes the title, the Hamilton Plan. And in the Hamilton Plan, it's actually kind of a funny moment in U.S. history because he's noted going up to give a speech in front of the Congress and advocating for a stronger executive, but basically shot himself in the foot as he called what was going to be the president the monarch and called for a strong monarch that can take on all threats that may come his way. So we see through that moment, many other moments, and out the Hamilton Plan itself, Alexander Hamilton wanted what looked more like a unitary system of government, a very, very strong executive, maybe even stronger than we have today, a system that looks somewhat like a monarch, with the ability to regulate the harms that, as Alexander Hamilton would say, could come with mob rule and anarchy. So I mention this because it's important to note that any of these founding fathers did not get their absolute vision represented in what we eventually created. But without their sentiments, we would not have had the compromised middle ground in which we have today. If it wasn't for Alexander Hamilton, we may have never been able to truly and easily step away from the Articles of Confederation, in which states have overwhelming power over the central entity and could result in what we saw happening at Shays' Rebellion, an ineffective central government. So we thank Alexander Hamilton for the advocacy of a strong executive. We look back at his final positions. We do see in 1795, when he was Secretary of the Treasury, he did step down after a conflict with Washington. If you're curious about political history, you might want to dive into that and tell me in the class why that may have happened. But we do not have the time for it today. But we do see his impact clearly represented beyond just Broadway, but through the institutions we've created in early American history. Now, Alexander Hamilton was not the only Federalist, of course, working diligently behind the scenes. We also see an individual that often does not get the credit deserved through history, John Jay. For one, this is the first Supreme Court Justice of the United States, one of the most notable positions. Our current Chief Justice is Chief Justice John Roberts, and you'll see through John Jay's career, he helped solidify the importance of the Supreme Court, although it was building up at the time he held the office, and really advocated for a good, strong, central, and federalist government. So, John Jay, right off the bat, there's one point that some of you may be thinking. He's a Federalist and the first Supreme Court Justice? I thought the Supreme Court was supposed to be a nonpartisan, non-ideological branch within our government. That is true. And we also see that taking some time for that precedent to be established, although you see through their actions an attempt to maintain a nonpartisan agenda. And throughout history, appointments were made in a sense where it was primarily based off of judicial experience over partisan affiliations. But we do see John Jay, the first Supreme Court Justice, representing the Federalist Party. It is worth noting, he only represented the Supreme Court as a Chief Justice for 6 years before he personally stepped down. I find this to be kind of hilarious looking back on it. He stepped down from being the Chief Justice of the United States Federal Supreme Court to be the governor of New York so he can, quote, make more of an impact and help with partisan politics. So he does step down from the nonpartisan position to help stabilize New York politics and defend the Federalist policy agenda in the state. We also see him acting as the president of the Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War, a pivotal role at that time. Contributed to the writing of the Federalist Papers. Really he wrote 5 of the 80 plus Federalist Papers, primarily focusing on some judicial processes, but foreign relations primarily. And we see, of course, maintaining the first chair as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and eventually Governor of New York. Really, truly helping stabilize partisan politics at the time and representing the full numerous individuals that represent a single partisan agenda, which is, in a sense, essential to having a political party system in the United States. And we can continue on without going into too much detail on early American history. And I will talk more about John Jay later on in this course when we talk about the judicial branch and the formation of the Supreme Court. Fascinating time as we see how George Washington determined who our first Supreme Court justices were to be. So, continuing the discussion though, let's look at the Democratic Republicans, sometimes known as the Jeffersonian Republicans, sometimes known as the Republicans. We can accept any of those. I tend to prefer Democratic Republicans, as we, of course, can easily get them mixed up with contemporary simple Republicans. So, who are the Democratic Republicans? In some senses, you see a mirroring of the contemporary Republicans, although in many others, you see an exact opposite approach. So, the Democratic Republicans have a strong prioritization of states' rights over federal powers. I always use this as an example because, of course, remember, the Democratic Republicans are coming predominantly from the South, the rural areas. And if you've ever been to the Southeast, you would know it is dense forests, and it is sometimes hard to travel just a mile. So imagine before we had established highways, imagine a society where the best of roads were dirt roads, connecting small rural areas that were significantly separated from other communities. When you have that much dense forest in between each community, you're going to see a wide range of policy agendas come up between those communities. You may have a Quaker community in one neighborhood and a Christian community in another and a Muslim community in another, and they would have different policy agendas based on the way of their lives and the culture of their community. So we see that in a sense being represented in the rural southern states in early American history. They had a wide range of policy agendas among each collective, among each state, resulting in them having a prioritization of having autonomy between these states for these nuanced policy agendas. So we see a strong prioritization of states' rights over federal powers, and they feared tyranny and authoritarianism. By that I mean they feared the overpowering government. They heavily read the sentiments of John Locke and the necessity of the individual to push back against tyranny and a tyrannical government when they do overreach. So understanding this is essential to understanding why they have these priorities. As we said before with the Federalists, we see with the Democratic Republicans, they were so fearful of a tyrannical and authoritarian government that has too much power concentrated in the hands of a few, that the best means to preventing this is by implementing strong foundational states' rights and having those act as checks over a strong central government. And remember, when we talk about a constitutional republic, the Constitution restricts and defines that federal government. So they would, of course, want strict constructionism. They want to strictly interpret the Constitution because we cannot bend the rules to enable the federal government to take further action. We need to maintain strict rules to ensure that the states do not get trampled in their autonomy, as you see echoed by the Democratic Republicans. Now, of course, when we have a government, when we have a constitution, it will eventually result in us having to engage with a market. So the Democratic Republicans believe in laissez-faire, a term you've of course heard from high school history, a line I like to say. Laissez-faire economic approach is, when simply defined, free market economy. It is a hands-off approach with limited government intervention in regards to domestic markets. So a Democratic Republican maintaining a laissez-faire approach to the to domestic markets would, of course, directly oppose the federal bank. States have their own debts, but states have the ability to pay off their own debts. It may take certain states more time, but it is worth the autonomy that they obtain through their own payments. They did not want the assumption of state debts on the federal level, the creation of the federal bank, because it's just another way for the federal government to have economic reliance over the states. And when we look at engaging on an international stage, the Democratic Republicans favored the sentiments that our sister nation over the Big Sea had in France, as they viewed the revolution that France had just gone through as similar and mirroring the sentiments and experiences of the American Revolution. So the Democratic Republicans at large feared tyranny and authoritarianism, and in order to restrict the federal government from being tyrannical, they want to prioritize state rights over federal powers. And they must strictly interpret that Constitution as a primary tool they can use to prevent the federal government from being overpowering. And that federal government better not get a little overbearing, especially in regards to our economy. The economy is an independent entity, and we must let the markets operate off of what Adam Smith would say is the invisible hand, basically saying regulated by price and competition. And once we have an economy, a protected state with individual autonomies among the states, the best nation to align with is France, the Francophiles, who are in a similar experience as we. So, what did Thomas Jefferson do to help influence the Democratic Republicans? Well, as we'll see about a lot of our founding fathers, there are a lot of direct citations arguing that Thomas Jefferson was adamantly anti-partisan, anti-political party systems. But he saw in front of him Alexander Hamilton's collective with John Jay and John Adams, who would become the second U.S. president, building a lot of momentum. Think of it, 1776, he is the vice president, surrounded by Federalists every direction he looks. The debates between him and John Adams have grown to be tumultuous, and we see a point of conflict between him and a old founding father and friend, and the office of the vice presidency being weakened. So Thomas Jefferson, noting this overwhelming federal authority, worked diligently with the likes of some others who were a little bit overwhelmed by the excessive concentration of power, like James Madison, who we'll talk about briefly. He worked to create the first political party system in the United States, the Democratic Republican Party within this system. Now, the Democratic Republicans, as we just focused, want an agrarian economy. They want a economy, when I put this in the simplest terms, based off of that starts with the farms, that relies on agriculture. So an agrarian economy with laissez-faire economic intervention, of alliance with France, our international sister over the sea, and a strong defense of state rights, echoed throughout all of his works. We see Thomas Jefferson did previously author the Declaration of Independence. If you've seen that documentary on HBO, John Adams, there's a great scene which is, for the most part, historically accurate, in which we had Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams sitting in a room debating the exact framing of the Declaration of Independence. A beautiful moment as you see through that scene Thomas Jefferson, of course, proposing the Declaration of Independence after they had debated that it'd be best to write one. He, of course, brought it forward, drafting the first draft and accepting the comments made by other founding fathers. Now we also see he eventually became the first U.S. Secretary of State, bringing a lot of influence at the time, focusing, of course, on these policies of agrarian economy, laissez-faire economic intervention, and building up of state autonomy. We remember from the election of 1796, he ended up becoming the vice president under John Adams, representing a need for a new amendment that will come, the 12th Amendment, as we have opposing representatives of opposing political parties maintaining the executive branch together. We also see at that time, while he was vice president under John Adams, the building up and formation of the Democratic Republican Party, as he was noticing that federal dominance that was occurring on the federal level, Federalist dominance occurring on the federal level. He also was later to become the third U.S. president. We remember from the 1800 election, in which after 36 ballots, attempts, and ties, where he and Aaron Burr were tied over and over and over again, he eventually became the winner of that election. He was frequently cited referring to that election as the Revolution of 1800, not because his ideas won over, not because the Democratic Republicans finally have representation in government, but because there is a partisan competition in this country that can coexist with constitutional stability. We will not have bloody and violent transitions of power. We will have opposing ideologies peaceful hand over the reins of governance. We also know, due to his presidency, we were granted the Louisiana Purchase, and us out here in Montana know all about how he helped with the Lewis and Clark expeditions and reduced national debt. So, as of course, it was essential to reduce that national debt to provide the autonomy for the states, as we need to diminish that reliance on the federal government. So we see a maintenance of these general policy preferences throughout all of his actions within the federal government. James Madison. This is a great individual to look at in U.S. history because he helped draft the Federalist Papers. He was known as the father of the Constitution, a hardline Federalist when it was a divide between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. But over time, once the 1790s elections occurred and that fruition of the dominating Federalist Party, we see James Madison working diligently with Thomas Jefferson to create the Democratic Republican Party. So, James Madison, of course, we remember is known as the father of the Constitution, helped author the Virginia Plan, which stood in opposition to the New Jersey Plan and resulted to the compromises to be made at the Constitutional Convention. Also helped draft the Bill of Rights, advocating for the interests of the Anti-Federalists at the time, and eventually representing the sentiments of the Democratic Republicans through these texts. And of course, we remember the Bill of Rights representing amendments, restrictions on our federal government to protect the states. So we see that states' rights sentiment echoed through his work in writing the Bill of Rights. Significantly, the 10th Amendment, which we all remember, the 10th Amendment is the amendment which states if the federal government does not have direct authority, direct power granted to it to address a specific issue, either through the Constitution or statutory law, then that policy is left up to the states and or the people. So we see that focus on states' rights and Democratic Republican sentiments in the Bill of Rights, which he helped write. He defended the implementation of bicameralism and checks and balances, as we remember from earlier lectures, inspired by Enlightenment ideas and Republican theory. Think of course, the John Locke's of the time. We remember he was also Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State, helped Jefferson form the Democratic Republicans during that time, and predominantly advocated for neutrality when it came to international relations, as there was significant tensions broiling up in Europe at the time, as we still saw conflicts occurring in France and throughout the entire region. And James Madison believed we needed to build up domestically before we engaged with international conflicts, a position that garnered significant domestic support. We also see, after Thomas Jefferson, James Madison coming in to act as the fourth United States president, led the U.S. into the War of 1812, but at the as the war concluded, he helped bring the nation in unity and really maintained a focus in manufacturing post-conflict that really significantly helped build up domestic manufacturing. And another aspect of this, you can see James Madison appealing to some of the Federalist sentiments once he's obtained office as the fourth president in the 1810s. But it is also worth noting that although he was representing some of these sentiments of the Federalist Party were to eventually disband. And the last Federalist representative within our federal government to hold the office of the president is John Adams. We will not have another Federalist representative lead the executive ever again. So, James Madison, after the diminishing of influence of the Federalist Party, you see starting to appeal to their sentiments and interests, again representing that sense of compromise that was present even in the most tumultuous periods of domestic conflict in U.S. history. Of course, we remember James Madison. Brief overview of his history. He was a political theorist early on. Some of the best works of political theory that we get from early American history consists of the Federalist Papers, and James Madison did author the Federalist Paper number 10, which is a primary reading this week, which you will have an assignment based off of. So really think about the sentiments you read in that text and how, remember, compare it to some of the Hamilton texts you've read before, in which you see more hardline defenses and advocacy for a strong executive, where James Madison has a bit more nuanced understanding of these conflicts and has a understanding of the complexity of the approach the government must take to address issues like factions. He was later a member of the Virginia Convention. He was also a member of the Continental Congress, Virginia House of Delegates representative, delegate to the Constitutional Convention. As we know, without his work, we probably would not have the federal system of government we have today, as he is the father of the Constitution. Later advocated for the Federalist Papers as they were written after the Constitutional Convention, and member of the U.S. House of Representatives, member of the body with apportionment based off of population, thanks to James Madison's sentiments at the time, thanks to James Madison's advocacy as he defended the idea of having proportional representation in the Virginia Plan. He was the Secretary of State, as we briefly mentioned, helped administer the Louisiana Purchase, and eventually the President of the United States. So we know who these political parties are. We know some of the dominating actors among these political divides. We know Thomas Jefferson and James Madison coming in with the Democratic Republicans, pushing back against the overwhelming Federalist power that was coming up in the early 1790s, as Alexander Hamilton was successfully advocating for a strong executive alongside the likes of John Jay and John Adams. The Johns love that Federalist power. So although we did look at this divide and another divide that existed prior, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, let's make sure we understand why this divide, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, is a political party system, while the Federalists and Anti-Federalists are not a political party. Oh my, struggling to get those words out. So the first reason on why this is a political party system, and the first political party system, is that they establish the president that the representatives will campaign for the office of presidency. Think of it as they institutionalized political organization. They made it to where there was clear avenues for advocating for single representatives for the office of the head of the executive, the presidency, along these party lines. We knew before the election what individuals the Federalists and what individuals the Democratic Republicans were bringing forward and advocating for the office of the presidency. We see this gradually developing and evolving over the next handful of elections in early American history, but it really begins to ferment in the 1796 and 1800 elections. We also see partisanship has finally entered the executive branch in 1796, when John Adams has become the second United States president, also the first partisan president, as he represents the Federalist agenda. So George Washington is the only president in U.S. history to not align with a single political party. We even know the great notable moments from his farewell address, echoing the need for a lack of partisanship. As you even will see it through the Federalist Paper number 10, as he echoes about the conflict of those who are most outspoken and in opposition to each other. So we also see that third reasoning being that both collectives finally had consistent policy agendas. We see those 5 points: what system of government they wanted, why they wanted it, what were they fearful of, how we're going to interpret the Constitution in this new system, how we're going to engage with the economy, and who our foreign allies are going to be. We see among 5 different wide-ranging policy points aligning interests among these partisan divides. So the Federalists, of course, wanted that strong central government, and I'm just not even going to go into it because I've said it a couple times now. So we see this is the first political party system because over the next few elections, starting with the 1796 election, we see the precedent of campaigning for the office of the presidency along partisan lines. We see that the winner of the election, representing the executive branch, from then on after, is a partisan representative, which is how we determine who the leader of the political party is. It is often the head of the executive. And we also know the third reason being there is finally consistent policy agendas. They have aligned on numerous issues beyond the simple ideological divide that existed with the Federalist Anti-Federalists, where it was ideological and driven over the ratification of the Constitution, and exclusively the ratification of that Constitution. So, brief overview and helping understand this through the lens of contemporary politics. Political polarization. It is the development of those factions. And if you were in class with me today and this was an in-person class, we would have a great discussion about if we view our political system or our political opponents as legitimate or rational. Does exposure to opposition lead to lower levels of polarization between parties? These are 2 primary examples of questions asked by political researchers examining political polarization right now. The extent to which we legitimize opposition and the extent to which we may have more positive affiliations of outgroups if we are exposed to them under ideal environments. Lenses in which, if you're interested, we can explore when writing your paper if you choose the topic of political polarization. But when looking at this topic at large, it is worth noting and worth understanding a key term: bipartisanship. You've heard this frequently before, and we need to confidently understand it as an agreement between 2 opposing political parties and political ideologies. And when we look at political polarization in contemporary politics, this is probably not a surprise to many of you, but bipartisanship, our ability to find agreement and compromise between 2 opposing political parties, has decreased by roughly 30% since 1989, most likely decreased at a greater rate as this data is a few years old. So political polarization in the United States, it is worth noting what the definition of bipartisanship is, and that bipartisanship is on the decline, as political polarization is, of course, if you understand the definitions of these terms, on the rise simultaneously. When bipartisanship goes down, political polarization goes up. It is a way to measure political polarization. So here I got the classic what do we learn slides, today's review questions. I'm not going to go over these as I just rambled on and on. Here are the answers. And then additionally, we want to have a little bit of a review. I will fly through these right now, as I know you are more likely to just pause this, ask yourself these questions, and review amongst yourselves. So, what type of democracy is present in the United States? Representative democracy. Of course, we remember that we are a constitutional republic, but what does republic mean? Republic means a system of government with a scheme of representation. Constitutional means it has a guiding document of a constitution. We are a constitutional republic and a representative democracy. You can use those terms almost interchangeably, excluding the constitutional part. And we remember federal, unitary, and confederal systems of government. I will bounce back to that as I have a graphic on the next slide. So we also remember, what did Shays' Rebellion reveal about the Articles of Confederation, the system we had in place prior to the U.S. Constitution, but after the Revolution? We see that Shays' Rebellion revealed a weakness of our federal government and our central government, and an inability to respond effectively and with optimal amount of time. We see bicameralism is the division within the legislature into two bodies, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Bicameralism was implemented due to the Great Compromise made at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And how many amendments were approved by the House of Representatives in the first draft of the Bill of Rights that James Madison proposed during the First Continental Congress, the first Congress of we see that that was 17 amendments he originally proposed, and eventually dwindled down to the 10 Amendment Bill of Rights that we have today. So, bouncing back to that second question, what is a unitary, what is a confederal, and what is a federal system of government? Unitary, when power is concentrated within the central entity, and then leadership and actions are dictated downwards to these state entities. Confederal, flip that on its face. Confederal is where power is concentrated within sovereign and individual states, who then determine the actions of the central government through frequent engagement and frequent debate. We also see a federal system of government is where there is an equal exchange of influence and power between central entities, between the central entity and the states. Of course, you remember the states, Montana, Washington, New Jersey, Virginia, the central government, Washington, D.C. And I know the graphics are a little different in each of these pictures, but although there are 3 states, 2 states, that doesn't matter. All we're focusing on in these graphics are the arrows and the influence, the direction of influence within a system of government. Now, what did we learn last week? What was the difference between a democracy and a republic? We already rambled on about that. How many amendments were in the original Bill of Rights proposed by James Madison? Originally proposed at 19, 17 accepted by the House. Later, 10 were ratified. What is the primary divide between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists? That is a divide revolving around the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Should we ratify it or not? Who wrote the Federalist Papers? John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. What does Federalist Paper 1 state? Federalist Paper 1 identifies the right and wrong side of the question according to the the author Alexander Hamilton. Federalist Paper 10, author James Madison, focuses on the threat of factions, and in a way you could see the threat of mob rule. And Federalist Paper number 51, you see James Madison once again advocating and defending the idea of checks and balances, an idea originally represented by the great political theorist Montesquieu, French judge. And then finally, what are the 3 reasons why the divide between the Federalist and Anti-Federalist does not represent the first political party system in the United States? This last one on the last slide, we see that it's because 1, there was no campaigning, 2, the executive was unaffected, and 3, the Anti-Federalists were simply an opposition group. They lacked a party platform and disbanded after the ratification of the Bill of Rights. They couldn't even choose a consistent pseudonym, as they wrote under Brutus, but oftentimes breaking that pseudonym and using others at the time. So, what is due this week in conclusion? We have a worksheet. Federalist Paper number 10 is due by the end of the week. I want you to read Federalist Paper number 10 and go through and answer the questions I have on that document in as much depth as you possibly can. Engage with the text. I know it can be a bit and almost like it's a foreign language, but try your best. I've highlighted a few sections of it that really deserve a couple rereads, and I strongly advocate that you really give it the attention it deserves, as if we did not have this text, we would not have the system defending our individual liberties to this very day. So we have a quiz due at the end of next week that will only cover weeks 1 through 3. So this week and everything prior. I will present a lecture next week on the role and influence of ideology and philosophies in the United States. That will not be on this quiz. It will not be on the next quiz. It will be on the final exam very briefly. This is primarily, that lecture will primarily be intended on giving you a more detailed understanding of some key terms that we often use and take for granted in American politics. So we're going to understand and mainly create consistent definitions that everyone in this class can rely on when using some at times inflammatory terms. But It's also going to be a deep dive into John Locke and how he influenced our founding fathers, Thomas Hobbes, Edmund Burke, really some fascinating ideas that were without them, we would not have the system we have today. So thank you guys for listening to me ramble on. A little bit of review. Throughout this course, we're not going to have many weeks of review, but I wanted to have a slower, easier start so we get an understanding of what's expected of you in this course and how the course is laid out. Of course, also remember to contribute to your discussions. You always have to contribute to discussions. The only week you won't have to do that is the 15th week. So always look to see what you have to do regarding the next discussion post. Thank you guys.